You begin with the assumption that knowledge guarantees truth. You trust your conclusions because they feel coherent, and you trust the coherence because it fits with what you have learned. But if you pause, even briefly, you notice that this trust has rarely been examined. You depend on your mind to verify everything except itself. Al-Ghazali confronted this problem directly. He realized that certainty is often confused with familiarity, and clarity is often mistaken for correctness. When you observe your own thoughts, you see that they defend their assumptions not because they are valid, but because the mind is uncomfortable with doubt. You start to ask whether knowledge ensures truth or merely persuades you to stop questioning. If knowledge convinces you to stop searching, is it guiding you toward truth or away from it? Al-Ghazali lived in a world saturated with confident thinkers. Baghdad was a center of scholarship, filled with theologians, philosophers, jurists, and mystics who each claimed access to certainty. Argument was a respected art. Logic was treated as a universal language capable of resolving all disputes. Intellectual mastery was equated with clarity. Yet this environment did not satisfy him. He observed that brilliant people often contradicted one another, each supported by elaborate reasoning. If intellect alone secured truth, how could so many equally skilled minds diverge so completely? If every method claims authority, what becomes of authority itself? Al-Ghazali saw that the confidence surrounding knowledge was built on fragile foundations. Sense perception, once trusted without question, revealed its inconsistencies. Rational inference, considered the pinnacle of clarity, depended on assumptions it could not justify. Even inherited belief, which felt solid, dissolved when examined from within. You recognize the same pattern in yourself. The mind assumes that what it perceives must be real, what it reasons must be accurate, and what it repeats must be sound. Yet none of these assumptions can defend themselves against the possibility of error. If every level of knowing depends on a deeper assumption, where does verification begin? You often rely on reason as if it were an independent, infallible faculty. But reason operates only through relationships between concepts, and those concepts depend on definitions the mind accepts before reasoning even begins. Al-Ghazali observed that logic can demonstrate internal coherence, but coherence is not identical with truth. A system may be flawless in structure yet false in substance. Reason is powerful, but it cannot validate its own starting point. It cannot step outside itself to ensure its foundation is secure. You see that reason clarifies what you already accept. It does not guarantee the reality of what you accept. If reason persuades you without proving its own reliability, why do you call its conclusions certain? Al-Ghazali suggested that understanding depends less on intellectual power and more on the state of the heart. He did not mean emotion or sentiment. He meant the inner orientation that shapes how you receive truth. A clear heart reflects reality without distortion. A clouded heart reflects only its own preferences. You notice how desire influences interpretation. When you want something to be true, arguments become easier to accept. When you fear an idea, you find reasons to reject it. The mind appears objective, but its movement is shaped by attachments that remain unacknowledged. If truth must conform to your preferences before you accept it, are you seeking reality or reassurance? For Al-Ghazali, doubt was not a failure of faith but a discipline of honesty. To question the foundation of knowledge is to clear the space where genuine understanding might arise. You begin to see that doubt, when used correctly, does not lead to confusion but to freedom from assumption. You recognize how often you believe something simply because you have believed it for a long time. Doubt interrupts this familiarity. It forces clarity by refusing to allow habit to masquerade as truth. Doubt becomes a way of making room for a more reliable form of knowing. If you never question what feels certain, how can you distinguish certainty from inertia? Al-Ghazali observed that insight arises not from multiplying arguments but from an inner transformation. When the mind becomes quiet enough to see without projecting its expectations, understanding appears on its own. It is not forced. It is recognized. You start to observe how clarity emerges when you stop trying to control the answer. A subtle shift occurs, not more analysis, but less interference. The recognition does not come from external proof, nor from the mind's insistence, but from a moment of direct apprehension. If understanding appears only when thinking relaxes its grip, what role was thinking playing before insight arrived? At the center of Al-Ghazali's inquiry lies the question most people avoid. If thought evaluates truth, what evaluates thought? You begin to examine not just the content of thinking but the act of thinking itself. Each thought appears, argues, and fades. None reveal the origin of the evaluator. You look closely at the sense of I behind the thought. You assume it is stable, the one who thinks, chooses, and reasons. But when you attempt to observe this I directly, it does not appear. You find only another thought claiming to be the thinker. Al-Ghazali saw that the mind cannot locate the one who thinks within thought itself. The thinker becomes another construct, another conclusion, another assumption that dissolves under scrutiny. The authority of thinking collapses when the thinker cannot be found. You realize that the mind speaks with confidence on behalf of something it cannot identify. It constructs an identity to stabilize its conclusions, yet the identity is supported only by the very thoughts it claims to govern. If the thinker is only another thought, who is searching for truth, as you follow the inquiry to its edge, you experience the same destabilization that confronted Al-Ghazali. Confidence dissolves. The structures you relied upon, reason, perception, inherited certainty, no longer offer secure ground. Yet this loss does not produce chaos. It produces honesty. You see that certainty was sustained not by truth but by the need for resolution. The mind dislikes ambiguity, so it constructs narratives to protect itself from the discomfort of not knowing. When these narratives weaken, perception becomes more open, less filtered by expectation. Al-Ghazali discovered that when the structures of false certainty collapse, something unexpected occurs. You do not fall into confusion, you fall into clarity. The absence of imposed meaning creates space for recognition. Understanding becomes lighter, less defended, less dependent on the mind's insistence. You recognize that truth does not disappear when confidence collapses. Only the illusion of control disappears. What remains is awareness itself, observing without the urgency to conclude. If clarity appears only when certainty fades, was certainty ever clarity at all? At the end of inquiry, thought becomes quiet, not because it has solved the question, but because it sees the limits of its own reach. The search does not conclude with an answer but with the recognition that the answer does not belong to thought. Al-Ghazali understood that real certainty is not constructed, it is received. It arises when the mind stops insisting on its own authority. You arrive at the same stillness. Awareness remains. It does not argue. It does not defend. It simply recognizes what is true without claiming ownership. When the searcher becomes silent, what remains that can still recognize truth?